Hello and welcome to the Future Food Finance podcast. My name is David Stevenson. I'm a founder of FFF, Future Food Finance, and also a columnist for the FT and CityWire and Money Week and various other publications. We try and each podcast talk to somebody interesting about what's happening in the world of agriculture and nutrition and food. And on this episode, we're going to talk to Sean Smith, who is the CEO of Eden Research PLC, which is an AIM listed, that's an alternative investment market listed, kind of plant science, IP, tech business that is really focused on providing what are called bio-pesticides. And over the next half hour, we talk a bit about the bio-pesticide market. And it's really very interesting because when we talk a lot about ag tech, people get terribly excited about robotics or that kind of stuff. But actually, really, what's quite interesting is replacing traditional fertilizers, traditional pesticides, and actually traditional fertilizers as well, by the way, but replacing traditional pesticides with biological alternatives. And Sean's really interesting about how that market's evolving and how it's particularly focused on certain types of farmers who've got certain types of produce. And if we're going to make a difference to things like biodiversity and also maybe encourage more sustainable farming and regenerative farming, actually biopesticides are a really big part of the market. So it's definitely worth a listen. Just a reminder to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and YouTube. And whilst you're at it, make sure you also check in every week on Future Food Finance with my colleague Frank, who does a weekly roundup of the most interesting news for investors of public companies involved in the whole food tech and ag tech space. Anyway, enough from me. Now let's catch up with Sean Smith from Eden. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Future Food Finance podcast. My name is David Stevenson. And with me today, I'm delighted to have Sean Smith, who's CEO of the Eden Research PLC. And just we'll talk a bit about what they do, but heads up, basically think biopesticides, amongst other things. And what's interesting, and the reason I've got Sean on is that actually biopesticides is a really interesting market within the whole kind of sustainable agriculture space. And there's very few ways of actually accessing this via the public markets. And actually this company is actually listed on AIM, which is the London alternative investment market. So it's a really interesting way of looking into some of the big trends that are going on in ag at the moment. Sean, welcome. I'm going to kick off with, I suppose, the $64 trillion question is, what is a biopesticide? Why should we care?
Sure. Yeah, no, great question. And it's a fairly broad church, if you will. The term biopesticide embraces an awful lot of concepts, ranging from using actual biological entities, if you will, organisms, to tackle disease, insect pressure, etc. These are all really falling into the category of crop protection products, right? So they're products that are helping farmers, growers, horticulturalists, etc., to produce their produce effectively, ultimately. The market in crop protection was historically dominated by synthetic conventional chemistry, and some names of which you'd probably recognize. But with the biopesticide approach, what we're really looking to do is leverage nature's own, let's say, resources. So in some cases, when they talk about biologicals, what that could mean, for example, is a predatory bug that targets another bug that might be a pest, okay? The same applies to the use of bacterial proteins, fungal proteins, etc., to, again, target what are effectively pests. But also within this pretty broad category of biopesticides, we have things like the products that Eden has developed, which are based on natural plant chemistry. So if you're familiar with our approach, what we're doing is we're basically leveraging the active molecules that are present within plant-derived essential oils, to give you a good example. So with clove oil, for example, clove oil is made up of a whole bunch of different stuff, right? A whole bunch of different chemistry. And what we're doing is we're focused on one of those molecules called eugenol. The same applies with thyme oil. So we're taking plant essential extracts. We are formulating in such a way that we're using the pure active ingredients, and then we're packaging them up in a clever way using yeast cell walls to help make the products safer, more stable, more usable in the field. So that's sort of the very broad definition of biopesticides and a little bit about our specific approach to it.
So we'll look later at your specific approach. Let's just back up a bit. So how big is the crop protection market? Now, most people, or at least if you've got a garden, will have heard of some of the big names out there, things like Roundup and all this kind of stuff. And they're probably aware that they've, so let's put it euphemistically, been in the press attention for a variety of reasons. So I think most people are sort of aware that the traditional kind of crop protection stuff has its challenges. So I suppose two questions. How big is that crop protection market? And I presume it's a pretty big market globally. And do these various biopesticides, are they beginning to penetrate in terms of market share? Are they as a group, not just your product, we'll talk about yours in a minute, but are they as a group beginning to come onto people's radar? Because when I pop down my local, I don't know, B&Q, for instance, and I look at things, I'm not a farmer, but I look at things to do with, plant protection, which is a subset of crop protection. You don't see a lot of the biopesticides on the shelves. So there are two questions. How big is the overall market? And are biopesticides actually getting kind of mind share at the moment?
Yeah, so I think one thing to differentiate very quickly here is to make the difference between home and garden uses and professional agricultural uses. Yeah. So we can talk a little bit about what Eden does in both of those spaces, but there is a real differentiator there. Okay. And so what is quite often the case is that products that are allowed for professional agricultural or horticultural uses are quite often not allowed for use in home use. And the reason for that is, that a lot of them require very specialist training, experience, safety equipment, et cetera, because in some cases, the products that are being used are they can be risky if they're not applied properly. And that's why it does require a high level of training. Overall, crop protection market is about $58 billion, if you don't mind me using dollars. Per year. Yeah. It continues to grow at, let's say, high single-digit rates or so on a global basis. And then overall, the biopesticide sector is estimated to be about $11 billion per year by, I think.
Oh, okay. So it's a reasonably big market already.
It is, and it's probably the fastest growing segment within the overall crop protection industry. I think the estimates are that it's growing about 15% per year. It might actually be a little bit more than that. A couple of years ago, it was a little bit less during the pandemic, but in any case, we see that growth continuing. And what's really driving that let's say biopesticide segment occupying more and more of a piece of the overall pie within crop protection is regulation. Regulators around the world are responding to consumer concerns and governmental concerns about health, safety, the environment, et cetera.
And Sean, I wanted to pick up on that. Was my next question, actually, which is, I suppose, why should we care, really? Because I suppose we've all kind of now begun to be aware that the repeated use of pesticides does have some implications, not least, as you said, because you have to, actually, if you use it, you have to be careful how you use it. But actually, we've become increasingly aware that this stuff is getting into the ecosystem. So why should we care that there's a replacement for traditional synthetic pesticides? Why does that matter? Which is presumably why the regulators are getting.
It's a really good question, because from time to time you hear people say, well, geez, we should just ban pesticides. Yeah. Which is sort of a mind-bending concept when you really understand how important crop protection products are for the efficient production of agricultural produce. So, for example, the world obviously isn't getting any bigger, and we're not going to colonize Mars anytime real soon. And of course, the population continues to grow at the rate that it's been growing. What that means is, when it comes to efficient land use, growers have to produce as much produce as they possibly can per hectare. And so crop protection products help them to do that. And I think a lot of times people can relate to home gardening a little bit more than they can relate to professional agriculture. And sometimes they don't quite understand why it is that farmers apply pesticides to the field. It's very easy if you extrapolate from your home garden to the field of several hectares. You can begin to understand the impact that pests can actually have on a farmer's crop. We're working on a project right now where it's a seed treatment that basically helps a particular crop to emerge, let's say, successfully. And in cases where the pest pressure is really high, a farmer could actually lose about 50% of their seed, which seed is one of the most expensive agricultural inputs out there. And you can imagine a farmer sowing seed and losing half of it. That goes right to the bottom line. And then, of course, on a macro scale, that can affect overall food prices, which we're all quite sensitive about at the moment.
Actually, just on that, have we any idea? I mean, it's a completely kind of abstract question, so I'm sure there's probably no answer to it. If we just gave up using pesticides, do we have any sense in which productivity would be hit? Agricultural productivity.
Yeah. I think it's probably better to think about that on a case by case basis, because it's I think at a very high level, it's hard to make an estimate about that. But if we think about this, for example, where emergence is impacted by the absence of one particular type of seed treatment. Again, that impact on the grower can be a 50% yield loss. So that's massive. With one of our other products that I can speak to, with a good amount of experience, we're selling a fungicide that's used to treat a disease called Botrytis. And when Botrytis actually hits in a vineyard, you can wipe out 70% of the crop in a matter of days, and that's if you don't have a tool to help. And so there are scenarios where growers aren't able to apply products right up to the point of harvest. So if they don't have the right product portfolio available to them, if the regulators in a given territory haven't approved, let's say, the right product, what can happen is, again, they get an outbreak of Botrytis, and lo and behold, they are in a situation where they can do nothing but just sit there and watch the disease ravage the crop. So yeah, the impact can be really severe.
And I mean, again, it's how long is a piece of string, but how much would a farmer spend on pesticides in a year? Obviously, it depends on how big the farm is, but are we talking thousands? If we're talking UK here, thousands of pounds, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I mean, give us a sense of in a farmer's expenditure. They obviously spend, as you said, most of their money they spend if they're an arable farmer on seeds. Would pesticides be the next biggest thing they spend their money on, or not?
Most definitely, yeah. Okay. Most definitely, pesticides are right up there, and plant nutrition products can be up there as well. Generally, plant nutrition products, as far as I'm aware, and that's not a segment that we're involved in, tend to be a lower overall expenditure. So we're talking about fertilizers, etc. With crop protection, I was just looking at one the other day where the cost to the grower for this one particular insecticide is north of £600 per hectare.
Wow.
And that's one product. Now, not all of them are like that, but at end user level, for example, our fungicide tends to sell at about 120 or so euros per hectare in the field to growers. Now, that depends upon what country you're talking about and really what the use rate happens to be. And that will affect them quite a lot.
And that we've now sort of got to the core of the issue, I suppose, which is that there's obviously a biopesticides market. There are various products out there. Yours is one of them. And I suppose if a farmer's spending a lot of money on this stuff, This comes down to pounds, shillings, and pence and efficiency, doesn't it? So,
absolutely.
So, you could say you have the most amazing biopesticide, but if it costs 10 times more than the synthetic one, they're just going to go, no, I love the idea of it, but I'm not going to spend the money. So this boils down to pound, shilling, pence and efficiency rates. So presumably, there's like all things, there's a trade-off between price and efficiency, biopesticides, and it's a kind of complex equation, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure if you ask most farmers, they prefer to do stuff that's good for the planet, but they don't. Yeah. They probably don't because it costs them more money. So do biopesticides cost them more money? And is it less efficient as well? So does it cost more, and is it less efficient, or is it not that way?
Yeah, great questions. Okay, maybe I'll tackle it this way. An effective biopesticide should be just as efficacious as conventional chemistry should be, right? There is another sort of, let's say, macro trend that's emerging. Now, if we look at some of the conventional chemistry that's out there, let's just talk about fungicides for a moment. Quite often the levels of efficacy that those conventional fungicides have is, let's say, 98% efficacious, right? Somewhere in that order of magnitude, between 90 and 98% or so efficacious. That can, of course, depend upon the growing conditions. But what you then, with a biopesticide, want to be able to do is approach that to the greatest extent humanly possible. But where some of the conventional chemistry, it's designed to be super efficient. And with a lot of biological approaches, what we're doing is we're adapting in one way or another, not just Eden, but other people's approaches to the same problem. You're typically adapting a natural approach, right? Whether it be through the use of predatory insects or use of plant extracts or what have you. And that can mean that levels of control are less. But there's something else that's happening, which is a major trend across agriculture around the world, but in Europe in particular, which is called integrated pest management. And if you think about that for a minute, what you're doing is you're trying to take a more holistic approach to agriculture. So a little bit like human therapeutics, it used to be you'd go to the doctor and they give you an antibiotic, probably a fairly high dose, you go away and job done. Today, what, clinicians tend to try to do is take a more holistic approach and tend to avoid the use of antibiotics where they can, or they maybe use combination products. An awful lot of antibiotic therapy today is based on combination products. So you're managing things like resistance and the acquisition of resistance. And that's where integrated pest management actually comes in. But to go back to the question of whether, do the products work as well? Yes, they can. Absolutely. For example, our fungicide absolutely is just as efficacious against botrytis as the conventional chemistry is. We see that repeatedly. We are in the process of preparing to launch a new seed treatment product. In that particular case, we're competing against another conventional product, and in that competition, we are just as efficacious as the conventional product that's out on the market today. Going to the whole question mark around, cost and will a farmer pay more? The answer is almost always no. Now, an organic farmer may wind up paying more, but of course, they're also looking for more for their produce ultimately in the end as well. And so we're not really in a position to price based on, let's say, sustainability or green. What we have to do is price based on the product features themselves. And so, like a lot of markets, where there's an added value to a given product. So, for example, to grapes, where there's added value, the farmer may be willing to pay a bit more, but of course they are then deriving added value from the products that are being applied. During the pandemic, it was there was a fairly major impact on a lot of people, a lot of companies in our position, and I think sometimes people have a hard time getting their head around why would the pandemic actually impact revenue for crop protection companies, and the answer is, well, if the demand for the produce in question, in our case it was grapes, falls off of the cliff because bizarrely, wine consumption, for example, dropped off of the cliff despite some of our best efforts during the lockdown. What happened was farmers were literally leaving grapes on the vine to rot in the field. They weren't even going to pay labor to harvest the crops. They were literally going to leave them there. And of course, in that scenario, they're not going to spend a penny on any kind of expensive input.
Yeah. So just going back to this question about efficacy and sustainability, just a couple of quick fire questions. What proportion do you see of the demand for crop protections products is coming through from organics? We keep hearing about the rise of organics and regenerative farming, but my perception is there's still a small bit of the market. Is it growing? Because presumably, they're your, to use an expression, the low-hanging fruit. Because I guess that they would think, we love your products because actually we don't have all these synthetic pesticides, so we will use your products because we're willing to pay extra. But my sense is there's still a tiny bit of the market, or am I wrong?
No, there's still a relatively small percentage of the market. It depends upon what crop you're talking about. So, for example, the trend toward organic wines, one of the major crops that we're focused on is grapes, obviously, if you haven't picked up on that one yet. There is a real trend toward organic wines, to organically produced wines. In countries like France, that percentage is generally quite a lot higher than 10%. But I would say across the market today is probably globally roughly 10% organic, but growing quite actively. Now, a biopesticide isn't always organic, right? And organic products, by the way, aren't always biopesticides. To give you a really good example, and it's absolutely nonsensical, but copper salts are allowed in a lot of countries as organic inputs. If you weren't aware, copper is toxic, it's persistent in the environment, it doesn't go away, and now is getting regulated much more highly. And there's kind of a disconnect there in this definition between natural and what's allowed for organic. And arsenic is natural. It doesn't mean that it's safe.
Exactly. Good for you. And presumably, talking about, you mentioned grapes, but presumably there's probably greater focus on what you do for products where the people eat them directly. Yeah. So what I mean by that is one thing for you to be, a wheat farmer, because your products probably get used in a processed structure. But I'm guessing if you're a strawberry farmer who basically has to deliver straight to the consumer, I'm guessing then actually consumers might be a bit more, well, hang on, do I really want to have my strawberry, which, by the way, has lots of pesticides. If you've ever tried to grow strawberries, there's lots of pests around strawberries. But presumably that's another dimension that goes into the mix.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on. I would say, and I don't have the figures to hand, but a well-educated guess is that when we come to cereals, grains, etc., the percentage of those crops that are grown organically is very, very small. And again, it's because that produce goes through further processing, and consumers are less concerned about it. They're less worried. Now, the trend is absolutely toward organic in that sector as well. But just as you said, when you put a strawberry in your mouth, or you open a banana, or any of these products, any of this produce that you consume directly as a consumer, then there is a high level of concern. And those are the crops that also tend to be, from an aesthetic perspective, there's a high level of concern about among consumers what they look like. And so you absolutely want biopesticides or pesticides as a whole that help to improve the overall quality of the produce itself. And that's one of the things that's well studied. And for example, in our case, not only do we help tackle disease, but we're also helping to improve the overall quality rating of the produce itself. And it's key for, but again, it's in the sort of fresh fruit and vegetable sector where that becomes really important, not so much around, maize, for example. Folks aren't too concerned about, farming,
absolutely.
what it looks like.
As for the last 5 minutes, let's just talk about your product and your business and as an investment. So, just run me through. You've already mentioned grapes. So you've obviously got product. I'm guessing good product aimed at grapes because you've talked about it. What other? Just run me through your key kind of niches and products, and then you generate. So I think last year was about 2 million in revenue.
Yeah.
I think it was, and then likely to increase. Just talk me through the products and how that feeds through to revenue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what we've done in crop protection, and maybe if you bear with me for 1 second just to set a little context, in crop protection, you have active ingredients, and then you have formulated products, right? And it sounds like a trivial thing to say, well, you've got these active ingredients. Of course, you've then got a formulated product, off you go. Just like pharma, the active is important, but what's equally important, and in some cases more important, depending upon what aspects you're looking at, is how do you get that active into a formulation and then make a product out of that. So we have, Eden is unique in that we've registered 3 active ingredients in Europe and the US and a number of other territories as well. Those 3 active ingredients in some combination make up our first 2 products, and they will make up our subsequent products as well. So we're leveraging that portfolio of active ingredients to solve different problems. And that, in fact, that's the reason we registered 3 different actives, was because we worked out that in different combinations, different ratios, etc., we can target a very wide spectrum of diseases or pests. So our first product is a fungicide. Initially, we were targeting this one particular disease that I mentioned earlier called Botrytis on grapes. We've been working with our distribution partners ever since to basically broaden that label out. And so in the crop protection industry, when you say to someone, well, what's on the label? A good way to look at that is, first of all, the label is literally the label that goes onto the package of the product itself. So nothing mysterious there. But what that label does is it defines what the allowed uses are. And farmers are very reluctant to go beyond those allowed uses. It's not to say it doesn't happen, but we couldn't promote a product for a use that wasn't regulated and wasn't allowed, and we wouldn't do that. So our first label, if you will, for that product was grapes against Botrytis, and we've been working to expand that, which ultimately translates into the size of our addressable market. We have a second product out on the market, which was launched a couple of years ago, and that's a product that targets plant parasitic worms. They're these little microscopic worms called nematodes. And I think nematodes are sort of coming into the sort of public's mindset today because they are a good example of biocontrol species. So I know one of the big things in lawn care right now, and also golf course and amenity management, is these grubs that basically destroy the roots of grass and have quite a profound effect. One of the biocontrol approaches to controlling those grubs is nematodes. Now, nematodes are a very broad group of different types of parasites. Some of them are negative, some of them are positive, right? In balance, they're as a species, or as a group of species, they're very useful, but they can cause crop damage. So our second product is a nematicide that targets plant parasitic nematodes. And then our next product, which we are rapidly approaching a very meaningful announcement about, is actually a seed treatment.
All right.
And that seed treatment provides a certain benefit to seeds that are drilled into the ground across a range of different crops.
And so, as I said, revenue terms, how's the revenue line been growing, and is it growing?
Yeah, so it was growing quite nicely, and then the pandemic hit, and the dynamic that I mentioned to you a little bit earlier. So 2020, 2021, we had not great years, and we entered 2020 with what was anticipated a very strong demand for the product, and as such, there was quite a lot of channel inventory to support that demand, which then, of course, fell away during the pandemic. So we are back to very nice growth. I think we grew about 50% last year in terms of revenue, and we're expected to do roughly the same again this year. All very much always depends upon how the season progresses. And for us, certainly for our biggest product, which is the one that's been on the market the longest, the fungicide, the product is growing very nicely. In countries where it's sold, we have a very nice market share. The product is very, very well respected. And that is in part driving growth as we gain market share, but also as we work to expand the label. That's had a massive impact on what we're doing. If you look at Spain, when we launched the product, we had really one disease, one crop, and that was it. And we've been working very hard with our distributor in Spain to expand that label quite significantly. So now it's being used on lettuce. The product's being used on grapes, of course. It's being used on a whole range of horticultural produce, peppers, melons, you name it. And as that label's expanded, the revenue that we have, for example, in Spain is multiplied by 7 times. So over a very short period of time. So the future for us is, of course, globalization of the products. So entering new markets. We announced at the end of last year that we had authorization in the US for both of those products, as well as our active ingredients. And we expect to see the growth trend continue, if not accelerate, actually, in the coming years.
And presumably, because you're effectively an IP company, your real strength is in your intellectual property. So you're not a million miles away from, I don't know, biotech companies or all, these kind of companies, in the sense that they're predicated on the value of their intellectual property and their patents.
That's right.
I'm guessing
that's right.
I'm guessing you're not profitable. So at what point do you get to be profitable and then be cash flow generative and sustainable in the financial sense of the word?
Yeah, I'm gonna give a slightly annoying answer to that question, so apologies in advance. But it depends is the answer, and the reason it depends is regulatory is everything in our industry.
Same in biotech,
and so and it is very much analogous to biotech. If we don't have approval, for example, if our seed treatment gains approval. And it does so, along the timelines that we anticipate through various regulatory mechanisms. We could approach profitability as soon as 2024. If, however, that process takes a bit longer, which it very well could, and again, it's not in our gift to say, but if it does take a bit longer, then that profitability, that break into profitability, will very much be linked to the growth of that product and its authorization. So once it's authorized in the first full season of use, that should be enough to propel us into profitability.
Okay, so with a fair wind, which in reality means a regulatory fair wind, within a couple of years you could be cash flow generative, but it depends, as you say, on the regulatory approval. Presumably, but just extending, just while we finished, extended the biotech metaphor further, very similar parallels of their industry, very regulated. They quite often depend upon, have they got enough money to get them through past the regulatory approval and all the trial stages and all that kind of stuff. But presumably, quite often the name of the game in biotech, and I'm guessing it's not that different in your end, plant tech, so to speak, is you get a viable enough series of products, you've got regulatory approval, and then some big company comes along and buys you. That is, obviously there are biotech companies that have gone on and prospered independently, but for a lot of investors, that seems to be the name of the game, because the big companies sit around waiting for the smaller companies to do the research, get the stuff through the regulatory process, have the product mix, and they go, "Thank you very much, we'll buy it now." So presumably that's a risk for you.
Yeah, it's a risk and but also a possible benefit. At the end of the day, we are partnered with a number of major multinationals, from Sipcamoxin, which is an Italian multinational who's quite well known in our industry, through to Corteva, who is, I think they're actually the world's largest agri-science pure play. and a good number of others, including Eastman, et cetera. So, it is ultimately conceivable that those folks would have an interest in acquiring the business. Certainly what we're really playing for ultimately is to grow the business to profitability, obviously, and to have the horsepower internally to continue to advance the development of our products based on the platform that we have available to us today. We haven't even talked about some of the other business lines that are potential engines for further growth, and that's again leveraging the same active ingredients for consumer products and animal health applications. We've had some sort of low-level activities around those over the course of the last few years. When I joined, I really wanted us to focus on crop protection because that's the area in which we were most advanced. IP, you mentioned, David, earlier, IP and how important it is. It absolutely is important. What's equally important is our portfolio of registrations. So the active ingredients that we've registered, that is the area of our greatest investment overall. And then the product registrations as well. But those are significant assets within the business. And, when we look at the major multinationals, what do they tend to do in our industry? They tend not to gamble very early. They would rather pay a premium for something that's perceived to be, very much de-risked than to get a discount on something very early stage. And so a good number of these companies won't get out of bed for, revenue that's less than £5 million per year turnover. And so, we expect that level of interest might develop as our business continues to develop. But again, we'll see where we get to with that one.
Sure, we've run out of time. Thank you very much. Very interesting look at the whole kind of biopesticides market. And you said we didn't even touch on the other kind of markets that you're looking at. So Eden Research, AIM listed. Check out their website. If you go to their website, got an investor presentation they did for the Master Investor Show, which very much gives you a good overview. Thank you very much, Sean.
Sure. Thank you.
Wow.